Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is terror and attempted terror attacks, specifically terror that is aimed at Israel and Israelis. In the past, it was always an open secret that Israel, many terrorists are intercepted before they could carry out their missions. We didn't know how many, but we knew that the members of terror cells were arrested. We knew that the plots were prevented. We knew that sometimes the act of terror was still in the planning stages, and sometimes perpetrators were caught en route. We knew a lot, but the numbers were never made public. It was very sketchy. That was then, and this is now, as they say. There has been a shift in procedure of late, and it is a direct consequence of the spike of terror that Israel, all of Israel, is now confronting. Israeli security and political leadership are publicly boasting about the numbers of terrorist attacks that they have prevented. They're releasing information in the hope of calming the citizens of Israel. It is a change in policy wrought with psychological needs even more than security needs. Israel's leadership is addressing the psyche of the country through their security apparatus. I choose to join the chorus of analysts and commentators who question the wisdom of this new procedure. Every Israeli knew that. Behind the scenes, security worked tirelessly and successfully stopping mass murder attempts by the enemies of Israel, haters of Israel, from killing innocents. Security services are called clandestine services for a reason. Regular people, should not know what they do, how much they achieve, and how their work is achieved. That's part of the mystique and part of their success. Israel is not a large country. Everyone knows someone who maybe, possibly, probably worked for the services at one time or another. Years later, some of these hunches are confirmed through a line of conversation. When a person under suspicion, let's say, displays knowledge of someone or something no one else knew, and that actually sort of outs him or her as someone who served in the services. But when leaders and top security officials, when intel brass announce their successes by giving details, they are doing it because they hope to bolster the public's faith and confidence, understandably during a terrorist spike. But people are already nervous, and that much knowledge may be too much knowledge, and good intentions may just backfire. Understandably, Israelis are scared, skittish, and tense, and the situation is only exacerbated because we live not just in a new world, but in a news world. Once upon a time, news organizations depended on photographers who quickly arrived at a scene and covered the event, and everyone waited for an already scheduled broadcast to hear about and see what happened. In truly horrific or momentous situations, the news broke into regularly scheduled programming. You remember that expression? Now everyone has a phone, and every phone has a camera, and everyone is a photographer. And social media has replaced those scheduled programs. Just about everyone has a platform to post their video and stills in their social media sites. Viewers are literally transported to the site of a terror attack at the moment of the attack, sometimes even in the midst of the attack. Talk about anxiety. Does this really help the situation to know that while the perpetrator was caught in advance or perpetrating a deadly deed, so many others were caught also? I hope so, but I'm not sure. I do not know when this spike in terror will subside. Thankfully, despite the successes of some terrorists in greater measure, the security apparatus in Israel is succeeding in their mission to abort attacks. Leaders do not need to calm their citizens by assuring them of what is being done to protect them. And while they should not promote their successes, I'm not sure that the details need to be so well detailed. Promoting their successes emphasizes their own insecurity. Some might even say their own failures. Knowing how many threats were intercepted does not make people feel good about the failures and the losses. It does not comfort the families of the victims who are mourning. For Israel, The unfortunate reality is that there are always terror attacks, always, even during periods of calm, when there are no spikes. And during those calm periods, there are also terror plots that are being intercepted and terror rings that are being apprehended. Israelis know and understand the risks of terror. They know that they need to protect themselves from people who want to kill them simply because they exist, simply because they are Israelis. And they know that no security system is perfect. Even during the periods of quiet and a lull, there is still terror. 2020 was considered a calm and quiet time in Israel vis-a-vis terror. That year in Israel, 3 people were murdered by terrorists. In 2021, 15 Israelis were killed in terror. As of 2022, who knows what 2022 will bring? Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from Ynet, and it was written by Nada Ayal. It was published on April 4th, 2022, and it is entitled, What Will Be the Price of Ignoring Atrocities in Ukraine? This column is subtitled, Opinion. Kremlin's crimes in Ukraine follow similar horrors perpetrated by Russia in both Syria and Chechnya. It must serve as a reminder that ignoring and remaining silent in the face of such barbarity will only see it spread closer and closer to home. That says it all, actually. Nada Ayal argues that the atrocities Russia is perpetrating in Ukraine do not stand alone. She argues that Russia committed similar atrocities in Chechnya and Syria, and now Ayal says it is time to put a stop to Russian atrocities. Ayal begins. The images and testimonies that have been coming out of war-torn Ukraine in recent days, specifically those from the region northeast of Kyiv, are horror incarnate. In the city of Bucha, the streets appear to be littered with dead bodies of civilians, some of men who were handcuffed before being unceremoniously executed. In other places, liberated by the Ukrainians, more despicable and heinous acts were uncovered. Bodies of women whose lower body parts have been burned in an apparent attempt to conceal acts of rape. The body of a man who was tortured and thrown into a sewer pit after being executed, the head of a Ukrainian villager who was murdered alongside her family and then dumped into a mass grave. Ayal points out that these Russian atrocities are all documented and on tape, and many are online. She continues, all of these were documented and caught on tape. In addition, there are reports of mass graves with hundreds of bodies, extensive and unusual looting, and even stories of a market in Belarus where Russians peddle the goods stolen from Ukrainians. Just before Russia's invasion of its neighbor, the one some Israeli experts announced would never actually happen, American intelligence warned of Moscow's intentions, which includes liquidation, deportation, or arrest of Ukrainian elite. In the port city of Mariupol, where thousands of civilians are stranded and Ukrainian forces are locked in a desperate and hopeless battle with Russians, residents have reported the deportation of hundreds of Ukrainians into Russia, whose fate thus far remains unknown. Ayal explains the real purpose of Putin's invasion, and it's not about NATO. She puts it this way: Moscow's endgame, Western intelligence agencies warned, is not merely the occupation of Ukraine, but the destruction of the very idea that is Ukrainian nationalism. Ayal now goes on to explain Putin's motivation and his goals. She writes, therefore, it is exceedingly clear that Moscow's plan for Ukraine includes the practical extermination of any and all opposing Kremlin influence. The shock felt in Ukraine and the West in the face of these atrocities is understandable and justified. The widespread demand to investigate Russia over potential crimes, and perhaps even crimes against humanity, even more so. But this is exactly the moment to stop and see the historical evil taking place before our very eyes. After all, before Putin embarked on his crime spree in Ukraine, he committed very similar atrocities in Chechnya. Worse still is that the Russian Tsar made sure that the bloody dictatorship of Syrian President Bashar Assad holds firm despite its own countless war crimes. In fact, there is no need to await historians' findings. The first drafts of their would-be accounts have already been published in the media. Those Russian pilots who bombed civilian populations in Aleppo, Syria, who were even photographed with Assad, were caught in Ukraine trying to carry out their disgusting mission once again. Nadia Ayal concludes her column telling us, warning us, even beseeching us to put an end to Putin's dastardly deeds because, unless he is stopped, Vladimir Putin will continue to act again and again in the same way. She writes, "The connection to our day and age is clear. The peoples of Asia, South America, and Africa have been repeatedly forced to take part in murderous experiments perpetuated by rulers and forces from the West. History's lesson is clear. Not only do thugs like Putin need to be stopped when they are not very powerful, but that such atrocities are not conducted in a vacuum, and the rest of the world has responsibility to stop it. Those who do not stop and punish the Russians for their crimes in Ukraine will find such atrocities occurring close to their homes." This is an excellent piece. Thank you, Nada Ayal. Next up is a column by Daniel Greenfield that was published in the Jewish Press on April 4th. This column is actually republished from Front Page Mag. The column is called "Ukraine Shows Hating Israel Isn't About the Palestinians." This essay identifies just how unhinged people are when it comes to bias against Israel. It is mind-boggling. Greenfield quotes world leaders as they demand Israel to act. In many ways, it's simply hilarious. In many ways, it's very sad. This is how Greenfield begins. "A war is raging 3,000 miles away from Jerusalem between two nations that share no borders with Israel and in which it has no troops, no interest, and no involvement. And yet, somehow, the war between Russia and Ukraine has come to be about Israel. Israel needs to make up its mind on Ukraine," a Foreign Policy magazine op-ed blares, as if the Jewish state were somehow a major player in a war between two much larger countries thousands of miles away. It's as absurd as demanding that the Dominican Republic, which is still larger than Israel, make up its mind on the border clashes between India and China. Now Greenfield quotes members of Congress who assert that the U.S.-Israel relationship is at stake based on Israel's reaction to Ukraine-Russia. Can you imagine that? These members of Congress can. Greenfield continues, "Israel's reaction to Ukraine will have bearing on future aid from U.S. to Israel," Representative Adam Kinzinger warned on Twitter. "Whatever bearing it has won't come from the never-Trumper ex-Republican who is retiring after becoming unelectable. But that hasn't stopped him or assorted politicians and media outlets from threatening Israel anyway. Ukraine asked Israel, no bigger fan of Israel than Lindsey Graham, for stingers, and apparently Israel said no. Senator Graham said, so I'm going to get on the phone with Israel. You know, we stand up for Israel with the Iron Dome. The only thing more baffling than why Graham felt the need to refer to himself in the third party is why the senator is demanding that Israel supply U.S. missiles to Ukraine. Isn't that his job? Greenfield now goes on to explain that Israel really is helping Ukraine. Greenfield writes, despite Israel's delivering 230 tons of humanitarian aid, including bulletproof ambulances, setting up a field hospital, taking in thousands of refugees, the pressure campaign insists that it isn't doing enough, and that the war not only involves Israel, but the outcome depends on it. The entire scenario is simply unreal, but it's only too real. The column continues. NPR found it vitally important to write an entire story based around the fact that there was a bar named the Putin Pub in Jerusalem. It's since been renamed. When a media outlet is this desperate to negatively connect Israel to the Ukraine war, the agenda is clear. Greenfield concludes, this exciting new hatred of Israel is not about Ukraine any more than the old variety was about Palestinians. Hating Israel is in the end always about one thing and one thing alone, hating Jews. It's hard to believe that this is actually happening, but I must say it really is happening. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 7 cartoons and memes today. The first cartoon makes fun of Putin and his misinformation campaign that puts forth the idea that Ukraine is a Nazi state and that Russia is blameless. Putin is looking down at Ukraine, burning, and says, those Ukrainian Nazis must stop bombing themselves. Like they're responsible for this. Next is another cartoon lampooning the way in which how Putin is presenting Ukraine to the Russians. It's entitled Russian Atrocities. And Putin, in the midst of a demolished area, saying staged production, fake news, Ukrainian hoax. Again, a total myth, but that's what he's pushing on the Russian people. This next cartoon pokes humor at the people in Putin's inner circle. A member of the inner circle explains the situation, and he says, those of us in the inner circle are dismissed as yes men. Western media perpetuate this slur. We are not yes men, he says. We are da men. Of course, I love this, the creative use of da as yes in Russian, also in Ukrainian, interestingly. In this cartoon, a husband and wife are walking in Red Square. The husband says, I fear our government is suppressing news about the war, casualties, and genocide in Ukraine. The wife says, there's a war in Ukraine? This is one of many cartoons poking fun on how Putin has shut down coverage of the invasion. This next cartoon uses a different device to critique the lack of news in Russia and Russian responses when they do learn the news. The cartoon is called Reactions to Russia's Atrocities in Ukraine. There are 3 panels. Each one represents a different response. In panel number 1, the person looks aghast and says, war crimes. Her reaction is labeled normal. Panel number 2, a person looking like an aged hippie and wearing a peace symbol on his shirt says, must have provoked the Russians by invading Ukraine. And that reaction is labeled abnormal. In panel 3, a youngish man dressed in the military garb says, fake news, Zelensky's a thug, and his reaction is labeled abhorrent. This next meme is of Tom Hanks in his character as Forrest Gump. He's sitting on the bench, and everyone remembers that, waiting to tell his story, and he tells his story, and he says here, and just like that, everyone on Facebook stopped being infectious disease experts and became international relations experts. This is so funny and so true. Every amateur is pronouncing the most ridiculous ideas about foreign affairs these days because they know better. This cartoon is included because all we need is a good laugh. The price of gas is going through the roof, and who knows where and when it will settle. In this meme, we see a couple having a candlelight dinner at, yes, you guessed it, a gas station. And the caption reads, she wanted to have dinner somewhere really expensive. I hope you're laughing because that's hilarious. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Hamas slammed Arab and Muslim countries that condemned the recent spate of terror attacks in Israel. Hamas supported the terror attacks. They were not responsible and did not claim responsibility. They certainly gave their support and heaped praise on the terrorists and their actions. Concerning the nations and the leaders who condemned the terror, Hamas published a statement. We were surprised, they said, by the condemnation. Resistance is the protection of people and holy places and is a right enshrined in international law, the Islamist group Hamas wrote. Israel's aggressive policy against the Palestinian people is one of the causes of terrorism and racism around the world, they wrote. The hardest thing for the people is their last statement, that Israel actually is the cause of terror and racism around the world. That's hard to understand. The now famous Texas synagogue, the synagogue that captured the attention of the world when the synagogue rabbi and 3 congregants were held captive by a terrorist, recently reopened. The congregation, Beth Israel, in Colleyville, Texas, has been damaged by the attack. Windows were broken, doors were destroyed, bullet holes were all over the place. Much of the synagogue needed to be repaired. Anna Salton Eisen, a synagogue founder, said that the scene reminded her of the abandoned synagogues in Poland, still marked with bullet holes from World War II that she saw while visiting the country in 1998 with her parents, both Holocaust survivors. She said, "I was standing in my synagogue this time, and it was just empty and silent, and it showed the marks of violence that had occurred," unquote. Eisen added that the return to their synagogue will help the healing process of her fellow congregants. She said, "We are not defeated, and we are not going to live in fear." An Israeli fisherman fishing off the coast of Ashdod spotted a hammerhead shark. That is unusual. The fishermen contacted the Israeli Nature and Parks Reserve. They sent out 2 inspectors, and they found the shark. It's very unusual to find a hammerhead shark in the Mediterranean. This hammerhead was over 6 feet long. The inspectors observed and filmed the shark for over an hour. Hammerheads are considered rare and endangered in the Mediterranean. Experts approximated that there were only 12 hammerheads in the entire Mediterranean. This sighting, in addition to being exciting, is evidence that the shark population is expanding in the Mediterranean area, and that is good news for the region. That's not the only thing happening in the waters off Israel. A bottlenose dolphin was found dead in a fish farm in the port of Ashdod. There are only an estimated 300 to 400 of these dolphins in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. They're considered vulnerable. That's important. The words are vulnerable. That means that they're at risk of extinction. That's a categorization that animal scientists use. The authorities and investigators, and of course, the expert marine biologists were all called to make certain that there was no foul play at the fish farm. They discovered that the body of the 8-foot-long dolphin had marks around its dorsal fin and its pectoral fins. It was determined that the dolphin had probably gotten tangled in fishing nets or ropes that are used to secure ships at the Ashdod port. Other marks were also seen on the dolphin, and according to the scientists, those marks were caused by members of the pod. The pod is the family or the group of dolphins, or called a pod, that had tried to free the dolphin. Dolphins work together to solve common problems. As a pod, they even coordinate to take out sharks. This is the 3rd dolphin this year to be washed ashore. All 3 dolphins were caught in the nets or ropes. Shel Silverstein, the beloved children's author and artist, is being honored by the United States Postal Stamp. That's remarkable. Silverstein was born in Chicago in 1930 and died in 1999. The Giving Tree is Silverstein's greatest work. It tells the story of the friendship between a boy and a tree. The commemorative stamp features a picture of the boy catching an apple from, of course, the tree. A marvelous lesson about the relationship between trees and people, or, that is, humanity and nature. That's what's really important. The Giving Tree is read ubiquitously in Jewish education. Children read the book themselves or have the book read to them every year on Tu B'Shvat. What a wonderful way to celebrate the Jewish New Year of the trees. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that the name Nazi is an acronym? An acronym is a word made up of the letters that abbreviate another word. It's not an abbreviation. An acronym must sound like a word. NATO is an acronym which is used a lot now. It stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Many other words used in everyday language and conversation are acronyms, and you might not even know what they are, or that they are. The word radar, let's say, is an acronym for radio, detection, and ranging. Scuba is another example. Scuba comes from self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Snafu is a great example. It's a military expression that stands for situation normal, all fouled up. Nazi stands for Nationalist Socialist Arbeiterpartei. It translates into National Socialist Workers' Party. Contrary to wide-held belief, Hitler did not create the organization. He joined it in 1919, and in 1920 became the leader of the group. The interesting part about the name Nazi is that it has everything in it. It's all-encompassing. It's encompassing nationalists and socialists and workers. all in one party. It's not true, of course, because in truth, the nationalists and the workers and the socialists don't get along at all. Actually, the party was really both anti-capitalist and anti-socialist. They were a small group that became a political party. In 1923, on November 9th, in a beer hall in Munich, they staged a coup d'etat. Hitler stood up on the table and declared that he was taking over Germany. Obviously, the coup failed. But the coup went down in history and is called the beer hall putsch. A putsch in German is the word for coup, an overthrow. As a result, Hitler's putsch, 16 Nazis were killed there. Hitler was arrested along with several others. He was tried for treason, convicted and sentenced on March of 1924. It was while he was in prison that Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf means my struggle. It's a book, actually it's 2 volumes in one, Adolf Hitler's personal view of the world and of Germany, and his autobiography. In the book, Hitler maps out his political ideology. It's verbose, poorly written, poorly organized. It is what it is, and it changed the world, unfortunately. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.